How China turned deserts into massive farmland, producing millions tons of food. China took land that was literally turning to dust, 6 million hectares of expanding desert, and turned it into farmland, now producing over 30 million tons of food every single year. That is more arable land than the entire country of France. You heard that right. And the craziest part isn't the food, it's what was hiding underneath that sand the whole time. And that is just the beginning. If that already sounds impossible to you, hit a quick like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how China engineered one of the harshest landscapes on Earth into one of its most productive. But first, you need to understand just how bad things were getting. Because China wasn't just losing farmland, it was losing the fight for its own survival. The sand that was swallowing China alive. Picture a wall of sand taller than a 10-story building moving toward you. Not slowly, not metaphorically. Physically advancing meter by meter, season by season, swallowing roads, burying villages, and erasing farmland that had fed families for generations. That was northern China. And it was getting worse every single year. China's arid and semi-arid belt covers 2.6 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, that is 4 times the size of Texas. 4 times. And across that entire zone, the desert was not staying still. It was expanding. Sand dunes were migrating into agricultural corridors that China's economy depended on. Entire towns were being buried. Farmers were abandoning land their grandparents had worked because there was simply nothing left to grow. By the 1990s, the situation had crossed from serious into something closer to catastrophic. Sandstorms born in the Gobi Desert were traveling so far that they were landing in South Korea every spring. Think about that dust from China's interior was crossing an entire sea and falling on a foreign country. The storms weren't just an embarrassment, they were a warning. Now, here is the part that most people never stop to consider. The sand wasn't just destroying farmland on the surface, it was destroying the possibility of farmland. Once topsoil is gone and dunes take over, the biological layer that makes agriculture possible, the microbes, the organic matter, the moisture retention disappears with it. Reclaiming desert isn't like clearing a field. It's like trying to rebuild a living ecosystem from a dead one, from scratch. And Beijing was not insulated from any of this. The dunes were advancing close enough to the capital that citizens were breathing the Gobi, not reading about it, breathing it. Sand in the air, sand on windowsills, sand in food markets. A nation of 1.4 billion people was watching its agricultural base shrink beneath the dunes in real time. Here is the brutal catch, though. Retreating wasn't an option. China couldn't just move its population away from the problem. The problem was too big, too fast, and too central to everything. So China made a decision that most governments would never seriously consider. It decided to engineer its way forward. But before a single tree was planted or a single irrigation pipe was laid, China had to do something most people never think about. It had to learn how the desert actually moves. The Great Green Wall nobody talks about. Before China could fight the desert, it had to understand it. And understanding it meant reading it not with the naked eye, but with satellite mapping and ground-penetrating radar surveys that tracked exactly how the sand moved, where it accelerated, and where it could be interrupted. Most people picture tree planting as a simple operation. You dig, you plant, you water. But at this scale, planting without data wasn't gardening. It was guessing. And guessing would fail. So, China mapped the desert like a military campaign. It identified the pressure points, the corridors where sand moved fastest, the zones where intervention would create the most leverage. And then it launched what became the largest tree planting program in human history. The 3 North Shelter Forest Program, known internationally as the Great Green Wall, began in 1978. Most people have never heard of it. That is not an accident. It doesn't carry the drama of a space launch or the spectacle of a dam. But in terms of sheer ambition, almost nothing humans have ever built comes close. The target was a shelter belt stretching nearly 3,000 miles across northern China. 3,000 miles. That is longer than the entire width of the continental United States from coast to coast. Now, here is the part that puts everything into perspective. This was not a symbolic gesture. China planted 66 billion trees. 66 billion. If you lined those trees up end to end, you would circle the Earth more than 100 times. The scale isn't just impressive, it's almost impossible to hold in your head as a single project. But planting trees in a desert isn't like planting trees in a park. Here is what most people get wrong about this. A seedling dropped into dry, loose sand without preparation dies within weeks. The sand doesn't hold moisture. The wind pulls the roots loose before they anchor. The sun bakes the surface to temperatures that kill young growth on contact. So before a single seedling went in, each pit had to be dug 40 to 80 centimeters deep and filled with organic fertilizer and moisture-retaining biological mulch. Think of it like building a small underground nursery. For each tree, a protected pocket of life buried beneath a hostile surface. The species chosen weren't decorative. Saxaul, tamarisk, drought-tolerant poplar, roots that bind sand particles, trunks that break wind, canopies that trap moisture, leaves that fall and slowly build living soil from bare sand, season after season. And the wall held. Sand advance slowed. Storms weakened. But stopping the desert was only half the equation. The other half was far more radical and far more precise. The science of making dead land breathe again. Stopping the sand from advancing was one problem, but China was staring at a second problem that was, in many ways, harder. Because a desert that has stopped moving is still a desert. The soil is dead. The biology is gone. The surface is loose, shifting, and hostile to anything trying to grow in it. Planting trees along a barrier line buys you time. It does not give you farmland. To get farmland, China needed to resurrection something that by every conventional measure was beyond saving. That is where the engineers came in. And what they built was quietly one of the most ingenious low-tech solutions in modern agricultural history. It started with straw, ordinary post-harvest straw, the kind left over after crops are processed, cut into sections 20 to 30 centimeters long and inserted vertically into the sand in a grid pattern, 1 meter apart in every direction. Each grid square, roughly the size of a kitchen tile, created a tiny windbreak. By itself, one straw square does almost nothing. But multiply that across thousands of square kilometers, and something remarkable happens. The airflow above the surface fractures. Wind that once accelerated across open sand and carried dunes forward gets interrupted at every single square. Sand particles that were traveling lose their momentum and drop. The dune stops migrating. The surface stabilizes. Now here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. China deployed this system across enough terrain that the straw checkerboard grids alone covered areas larger than some American states. Tens of millions of tons of post-harvest straw pressed into the ground by hand, section by section, across some of the most remote and hostile terrain on the planet. It was not high technology. It was scale applied to a simple physical principle, executed with a consistency that is almost hard to believe. But straw alone only buys stability. It doesn't rebuild biology. So, alongside the checkerboards, Chinese agronomists introduced chemical soil binders, compounds sprayed across the surface that crust the sand, locking particles together long enough for organic matter to begin accumulating underneath. Think of it like applying a temporary skin over a wound. The skin doesn't heal the tissue, but it holds everything in place long enough for healing to begin on its own. Here is what makes this incredibly exciting. Once the surface stabilized and the first organic layer began to form, the drought-resistant shrubs planted inside the checkerboard grids started doing the rest themselves. Roots binding particles deeper, fallen leaves breaking down into primitive soil, moisture collecting in the shadows the plants cast. The ecosystem, once given the smallest foothold, began rebuilding itself from the bottom up. Season by season, grid by grid, across millions of acres of land that every outside observer had written off as permanently dead. But a stabilized surface and recovering soil still couldn't grow crops without solving the one problem that defined the desert more than anything else. There was almost no water. Water from nothing. Water is the one thing a desert refuses to give you. Some of the regions China was trying to reclaim receive less than 4 inches of rain per year. 4 inches. To put that in context, London gets nearly 20 times that amount. And yet, somehow, China was about to grow millions of tons of food in it. The answer wasn't to find more water. It was to waste less of it than anyone had ever managed before. Traditional irrigation, the kind used across most of the world's farmland, loses enormous amounts of water to evaporation before it ever reaches a root. In a hot, dry environment, that loss isn't just inefficient, it's fatal to the entire operation. You can pump water from hundreds of miles away and still watch most of it disappear into the air before it does any good. China needed a system that delivered water not to the surface, but directly to the root, molecule by molecule, if necessary. So they built one, a precision drip irrigation grid threaded through terrain that most engineers would have looked at and walked away from. Underground pipes. Emitters calibrated to release between 2 and 8 liters per hour directly into the root zone of each plant. No runoff, no evaporation, no waste. Think of it like an IV drip for a patient in critical care. The fluid goes exactly where the body needs it, in exactly the amount required, nothing more. Now here is the part that most people never think about. The water savings weren't marginal. Compared to traditional irrigation methods, this system reduced water consumption by 30 to 60%. In a landscape where every drop was once considered a luxury, cutting water use in half wasn't just an engineering achievement. It was the difference between a project that was theoretically possible and one that could actually be sustained for decades. Here is what makes this even more remarkable. The drip grid wasn't laid across a flat, cooperative landscape. It was threaded through terrain that had been recently stabilized from active dunes uneven, fragile, and still hostile. Engineers had to design systems flexible enough to function in soil that was still, in places, more sand than earth. And it worked. Crops took root, yields climbed. Land that had received almost no rainfall in recorded history began producing harvests. But here is the thing. As extraordinary as the engineering was, it still couldn't explain what China chose to grow in these places, because the crops that came out of the desert weren't just surviving, they were outperforming everything else on Earth. The crops that shouldn't grow here. Here is the part that nobody talks about. China didn't reclaim the desert and then figure out what to plant. The crop selection was deliberate, calculated, and in some cases, counterintuitive, to the point of seeming reckless. Because the plants that thrive in reclaimed desert aren't the ones you'd expect. And the yields they're producing aren't just competitive with traditional farmland. In some cases, they're beating it. Start with grapes. The Turpan Basin in Xinjiang sits in a depression so deep it sits below sea level in places. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It receives almost no rainfall. By every conventional measure of agriculture, it should produce nothing. And yet Turpan's vineyards are now generating 1.5 million tons of fresh grapes every single year. 1.5 million tons. That is roughly equivalent to the entire annual grape output of the United States. Here is why. The desert gives Turpan something temperate farming regions simply cannot replicate. 3,000 hours of sunshine per year. And temperature swings of up to 80 degrees Fahrenheit between day and night. That swing is the key. During the day, intense heat drives photosynthesis at maximum rate. At night, the cold slows the plant's metabolism, locking sugars inside the fruit instead of burning them off. The result is grapes that accumulate 40% more sugar than anything grown in moderate climates. The desert isn't a handicap here. It's the entire advantage. Now, here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. Cotton tells an even bigger story. Xinjiang's reclaimed and expanded agricultural zones now produce 5 million tons of cotton per year. 5 million tons. That is 20% of the entire world's cotton output coming from a single region that was, within living memory, considered largely unworkable. The mechanized harvesting operations running across these fields operate at a scale that traditional cotton-growing regions simply cannot match. But it doesn't stop at grapes and cotton. Wolfberries, jujube, black rice, industrial hemp crops selected not just for their drought tolerance, but for their export value. China wasn't growing subsistence food in the desert. It was building export industries. crops chosen because they grow well in extreme conditions and sell at premium prices on global markets. Think of the desert like a late-night kitchen with almost no ingredients. A bad cook sees nothing to work with. A great cook looks at what's actually there, the extreme heat, the intense sun, the cold nights, the mineral-rich sand, and builds a menu around it. That is exactly what China's agricultural researchers did. They didn't fight the desert's conditions. They recruited them. And then came the solar greenhouses. 2,000 square kilometers of enclosed growing space producing strawberry yields of 60 to 100 tons per hectare. That is 4 times the output of open field farming. 4 times. In the desert, China had figured out not just how to grow food in the harshest land on Earth, it had figured out how to grow more food per acre than almost anywhere else. But feeding people was only part of the plan. What happened next turned the desert into something nobody had predicted. An economy. The villages that moved into the desert. Most governments, when they reclaim land, treat it as an engineering problem. Fix the soil, plant the crops, ship the food out. The land is productive. Job done. China looked at the same equation and asked a different question entirely. What if the land wasn't just productive? What if it was inhabited? What if you didn't just grow food in the desert, but built entire communities there? What if the reclamation wasn't just an agricultural project, but an economic one? That question led to one of the most ambitious and least discussed human resettlement programs of the modern era. China relocated hundreds of thousands of farmers directly into newly reclaimed desert land. Not to the edges of it, into it. Towns were built from nothing. Roads were laid across terrain that had been active dunes a decade earlier. Markets, schools, and distribution networks followed. China wasn't just greening the desert, it was populating it. And the scale of infrastructure required to do that was staggering. Think about what it takes to build a functioning town in the middle of a reclaimed sand dune. You need power, you need water, you need roads stable enough to carry freight, you need communication infrastructure. You need supply chains that can get equipment in and product out. Every single one of those things had to be engineered from scratch, in terrain that was still, in places, geologically young and fragile. Here is what most people get wrong about this. The resettlement wasn't just a social policy, it was a strategic economic decision. Farming at this scale requires labor. Permanent, skilled, committed labor, not seasonal workers bust in and out. By building communities directly in the reclaimed zones, China created a resident workforce with a direct personal stake in the land's productivity. Farmers who live on the land they work maintain it differently than contractors who leave at the end of a season. The villages weren't a byproduct of reclamation. They were part of the engineering. Now here is the part that blows people's minds. The economic engine that emerged from these desert communities wasn't powered by food alone. It was powered by energy. Because the same desert that had been engineered for agriculture was also being engineered for solar power simultaneously. In the Gobi Desert, 196,000 solar panels were laid out across 15 million square feet of reclaimed land, an area roughly the size of 500 football fields arranged in the shape of a galloping horse, visible from the air. Over a decade, that installation generated $10 billion in economic value. $10 billion from a desert. And then came the detail that reframes the entire story. The solar panels and the farms weren't competing for the same land. They were sharing it. In what became known as the solar sheep model, panels were raised high enough off the ground to create shade beneath them. That shade reduced surface evaporation. Reduced evaporation allowed vegetation to grow. Vegetation fed sheep grazing underneath the panels. 1 square meter of reclaimed desert was simultaneously generating electricity, growing animal feed, and producing livestock income. 3 revenue streams from a single patch of land that a generation ago was a shifting sand dune. If the economics of desert farming surprised you, the next part is going to be even harder to believe. Hit subscribe so you're there when we cover more stories like this one. China had built farms, towns, power stations, and livestock operations in a place that the rest of the world had written off permanently. And it had done all of it while the clock was still running on a problem that hadn't been fully solved. Because 19% is not 100%, and the gap between those two numbers is where the real story lives. What China's desert farms are actually feeding. Here is the number that ties everything together. 30 million tons of food every single year, coming out of land that was, within living memory, considered permanently lost. 30 million tons. That is enough to feed the entire population of Canada 3 times over, produced from terrain that every conventional model of agriculture said was beyond recovery. But the food is almost not the point anymore. China has sequestered billions of tons of carbon inside the root systems, trunks, and soil biology of the ecosystems it rebuilt from bare sand. The sandstorm frequency that once choked Beijing and crossed the sea into South Korea has been cut in half. The biological layer that makes agriculture possible, the microbes, the organic matter, the moisture, is returning to land that hadn't held it in centuries. China didn't just grow food in the desert. It rebuilt the desert's capacity to sustain life. Now here is what puts everything into perspective. China has restored only 19% of its total desert area so far. 19% produced 30 million tons of food annually, cut sandstorms in half, generated $10 billion in solar energy value, and supported hundreds of thousands of people living in communities that didn't exist a generation ago. Read that again slowly. 19% did all of that. The remaining 81% is still out there. And this is where the story stops being about China and starts being about something much larger. Right now, 1/3 of all land on Earth is degraded or actively turning to desert. 1/3. That is an area larger than the entire continent of South America losing its ability to support agriculture, absorb carbon, or sustain communities. China looked at its version of that problem and decided documentation wasn't enough. They are engineering answers to a physical problem that exists on every continent. The desert doesn't care about borders. And the tools that stopped it in the Kubuchi and the Gobi work on the same physical principles, whether you're in sub-Saharan Africa, the American Southwest, or Central Asia. China did not green the desert because it was easy. There are unresolved controversies in the Xinjiang supply chain that the world is still reckoning with. There are desert aquaculture operations that require water quality management that can fail without warning. 19% is not a finished project. It is a proof of concept. But what a proof of concept it is. China looked at 2.6 million square kilometers of advancing sand 4 times the size of Texas and decided that the only question worth asking was not whether transformation was possible, it was how long it would take to engineer. That question is now sitting in front of the rest of the world, and we haven't answered it yet. If this changed how you think about what's actually possible with land we've already written off, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the rest of the world will adopt China's desert farming methods? Or will politics and economics make sure this stays a one-country experiment?